The first time I encountered Jim Florio was in the 1980s, and I was a reporter for the Atlantic City Press, and he was the congressman from the 1st Congressional District. And I was covering a public hearing, and then Congressman Florio was asked to speak about toxic waste sites. And I'd never met him before. And he stood up and started talking about the science of Superfund, talking about what toxic waste does in very specific terms. And he's telling the audience all this scientific data, and he's going on for about 15, 20 minutes. And I'm thinking, he doesn't have any notes. He's talking off the top of his head, and he just had a complete command of every detail of that issue. And I went back to the newsroom and I said, who is this guy? He was just so impressive. Well, after reading from his book, I think you all know from Standing on Principle that Jim Florio is one of the most accomplished public servants and one of the most serious, thoughtful leaders on public policy that New Jersey has ever known. In Congress, he authored the landmark Superfund law to clean up the most polluted toxic waste sites. He was a leader on transportation and environmental issues, and he was a prime mover in getting the pine lands preserved and protected. As the state's 49th governor, Jim Florio bucked tremendous political pressure to enact the nation's toughest assault weapons ban. He put New Jersey's fiscal house in order, even if it meant doing the unpopular thing of raising taxes. He did this at his own political peril and for putting the public good above his own interest. He was awarded the 1993 Profiles in Courage Award by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. These are only some of Governor Florio's highlights. There are many. He is a Navy veteran. He was a boxer. He today is a founding member of the Florio, Perucci, Steinhardt, and Capelli law firm. But really, bottom line, very few people have had such a positive impact on public policy and quality of life in New Jersey than has Governor Florio. We're very fortunate to have him here today, and I'd ask him to come up and say a few words first.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Let me first of all express my appreciation for the opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you and take your questions, and I'll try to respond to them. It's interesting, thinking about the time going by, I had a reminder last week when I went to the Acme in Moorestown, is where I live, and the young woman behind the checkout counter had this faint glimmer of recognition in her eye when I got up. So I got up to her and said, "Hey, mister, didn't you used to be somebody?" Which I wasn't sure what the answer was, but I appreciate that. But I wanted to talk to you today about some things that are on my mind and get from you things that are on your mind. Let me give you a little bit of background, because I think it's important to appreciate the fact that we're all the products of our experiences. Things that we've gone through help us understand better what it is, how we form our values and our views. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, so I'm not a native New Jersey person. But when I was 17, I quit high school and joined the Navy, got my GED diploma there. And while I was in the Navy, my parents moved out of Brooklyn to start working. My father worked in the shipyards. Neither of my parents went to high school, finished high school rather, but both of them were hardworking people. And my Brooklyn Navy Yard closed where my father worked, moved to New Jersey, and that's how I got to New Jersey. I went to Trenton State Teachers College, which is now the College of New Jersey. It's interesting to appreciate the fact that tuition then was $120 a year. So that's very interesting. I worked my way through college because you could work your way through college. It's a little harder to do that nowadays. And the whole idea of getting the GI Bill of Rights, the Korean War GI Bill gave me $70 a month. That was how I could afford to go to college. So things have changed fairly dramatically, as you can appreciate. And I guess what I've been doing recently is getting involved in public policy matters. Because I think it's important that people do become involved. I understand many of you read the book that I put out. The key theme of the book, in some respects, is the fact that if we want to have good public policy, that is policy that is in the public interest, the key thing is to be able to get people engaged and informed. People have to, and I'm talking about real people, not only political people. We have to have real people fully engaged in the process. Engaged because that's what our system is. It's called participatory democracy. That system requires people to become involved because the system doesn't work unless you work at making it work. And people have to become informed because the whole system that we have is becoming more complex. It's becoming more difficult to try to understand. There are more choices. The things that you're learning here in school are things that will be required for people to have command of. If you don't have command of the facts, you can't really resolve problems. You can't fix a problem if you don't understand the problem. So becoming involved is absolutely essential, not only for our government, for our whole society. And that's really what we were talking about. And the extra problem that is coming forward is that we're living in a period of great change. Not normal change, but change that's dramatic, change that is complex, change that's very rapid. It's so rapid, in fact, it's inhibiting our ability to formulate the policies necessary to deal with the consequences of the changes that we experience. So we're behind the curve more and more. We've got to be able to make sure that we know what's going on so we can deal with answers to some of the problems that were facing us. And what we've been doing instead is applying old policies to new problems. And accordingly, we're behind the curve, as I said. We're not really dealing with things in a real way. A good example I can give you is some of you may recall this, some of you may not recall it. In 2008, we had what we called the Great Recession, a big economic problem area. And it should not really have surprised us we'd have this problem because we were applying to our financial problems, to our monetary and financial problems, old policies that were really created in the 1930s. 1930s, the Great Depression. We're still applying those answers to the questions that we had. And the 1930s policies, which were still on the books, didn't know anything about the current problems. Credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, other types of exotic derivative products were not being addressed. Accordingly, we had difficult problems. And we had the deepest recession that we had since the 1930 Great Depression. That's an example of us being behind the curve. You can think of the ones today, nowadays, climate change, gun violence, pharmaceutical price. We have all these problems that we're dealing with, but we're not dealing with them with new relevant goals, new relevant achievement capabilities. One of the things that we've got to be able to do is to be able to become more relevant. And that requires to become engaged and informed, as I said. That's something that we all are required to do. We got to start thinking as well about new approaches to fundamental questions. For example, our taxation system in this country. The country was formed in 1787. We have changed a lot of things, but there are things we have not changed. Our security questions. 1787, we were very secure, 2 oceans, remote from everybody in the world. We're not remote anymore. We've got to start thinking about how it is we frame are things that we have to do in a way that's relevant to today's. And therefore, I'm spending a lot of time, as I said, involving myself in public policy because it's a need to get people engaged in this process. Give you an example. I'm working very hard on the whole issue of clean energy to deal with climate change. One of the specific proposals that I'm working on is offshore wind energy power right off the coast of New Jersey. We're going to have the largest facility, wind farm facility in the United States of America is going to be off the coast of Atlantic City. And this is something that the Europeans have been doing for 20 years, and we're just getting around to doing it in the United States. And New Jersey has the opportunity to sort of lead the way. And that's a good thing. And the benefits are clean air, the benefits are climate change remediation, economics, a whole new industry, a whole new series of opportunities are going to flow from this. European companies are planning to come to the United States to build wind turbines here as opposed to in Europe. All kinds of job opportunities will be coming. That's a good example of an opportunity that we should put together and develop as much as possible in a positive way. There are lots of other opportunities here in the Atlantic City area, transportation, aviation opportunities out of the airport. They're going to be there. So, and this is particularly important for people like yourselves who are thinking about what you're going to do with the rest of your lives, picking professions, knowing what, you're not going to pick a profession to be a coal miner. You're not going to pick a profession that's not relevant to the future. You want to think about these things and help shape them and become involved in politics. You've got a wonderful laboratory opportunity now with this election that we're going to be experiencing in the next year. It's an opportunity to become engaged in the process and become participants. I became involved in politics in the 60s and had an opportunity. I moved, after I graduated from college, I went to Columbia for a year for a graduate degree. And then I went to Camden County to Rutgers Law School, to go to law school there. And I became involved in politics as a young man in law school at the local level. And I would urge all of you to consider local politics exposure, to learn a lot about human nature. You'll learn a lot about government. You'll learn a lot about the substance of the topics that government deals with. I know I counsel some law students. One of the things I tell the law students that ask for my advice is that in the field of law, the key to success in the future is specialization. If you're going to be a lawyer, and you intend to be lawyers, I would urge you for mercenary purposes as well as fulfillment purposes to see if you can find an area that you want to specialize in. Environmental law, telecommunications law, all kinds of different specialty areas. More and more as the economy develops in the way that it's developing, it's important for us all to understand that things are going to be highly specialized to a large degree. You could be better off, no better off than to find which direction you want to go. I was 32 years old before I finally finished education and went into the real world. You're probably going to be a little younger than that. But it's important to get a full understanding of which way things are going so you can get there ahead of people. Again, I'm going to just finish up now and then have some interaction with John. I would just urge you all to become involved as much as possible in what's going on. I always feel a little bit annoyed when I interact with people who tell me that they're too good to be involved in politics. If you think about it, if all the good people drop out, who's left? So one of the things I would urge you all is to become involved in politics, involved in policy making, involved in your surroundings. It's something that is key to success in continuing to make our system relevant to the goals and aspirations we have. This coming election, and I'll not be overly partisan, is really going to offer people a choice between dramatically different end goals. And I would just urge you all to become involved, learn the issues, read a lot. I've been taking a project of my own on recently. I've been reading old books that I read when I was in college. Really a wonderful experience. And I will just give you one book that I read just a little while ago. It's a book by a fellow named Eric Fromm, F-R-O-M-M. It's called Escape from Freedom. An excellent book with insights that are as relevant today as they were 60 years ago when the book was written. And there are lots of older books. There's something called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, H-O-F-F-E-R. Anyone who's a public science, a political science major or interested in political science should read these books. There are a whole bunch of other books that you ought to start looking at. You can't go wrong understanding what people think, to have a full, rounded background. Read lots of different approaches, different philosophical approaches. I would just urge you all to consider public affairs as an area of interest, as a citizen, as well as an academic person. And I guess the last point I'd make is that I'd urge you also to reject the advice that was given by a very prominent American many years ago. It was that government is not the answer, government is the problem. That is hopelessly naive at best. Government is not inherently good, it's not inherently bad. It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used in the hands of people of good faith who are honest and competent to ensure that our society runs in a way that is good for the public interest. So I urge you all to continue to maintain an awareness of the importance of our society. John?
Thank you, Governor. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and I'm going to leave plenty of time for student questions, and we can come back to mine if we have time later. But let's start looking back at your time at Rutgers Law School. Did your experience there in any way shape your view of constitutional issues or your views about government?
Yeah. Well, while I was in law school, as I said, I became involved in local politics. I was a law student. I was also working my way. I was a night watchman at Woodrow Wilson High School in Camden. And I got $70 a month from the GI Bill of Rights, which helped me get there. I was married, had 2 children at the time. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to do a lot of things, but what I did do was become involved in local politics. I arrived in Camden from freshman graduate school at Columbia, interested in political science, called the mayor at the time, and told him that I was interested in politics, and what should I do? And he sent a ward leader. This is Camden in 1963. Old machine politician in the city of Camden. The ward leader came around to see me. Thought I was okay, so he made me a district leader, which means I was in charge of the politics, Democratic politics in Camden, in an area in the city of Camden. So I learned a lot from that position. And then my studies in school gave me the academic background, particularly focusing on constitutional questions. But the combination of academics and real-life world helped me understand the political process a lot better than people who didn't have both of those experiences. So law school was a very important thing. I taught courses as well as a still a student teacher as well, doing substitute teaching. That's a source of funding, doing that as well. But law school was very important to me. I'm interested in the law, but I'm interested in public policy. And what I've been doing is working in that capacity for a very long period of time as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Governor, I think the students would benefit from hearing sort of a case study that shows how a complex political process works while you're trying to pass a major policy initiative. And so we're located here in the New Jersey Pinelands, and it's been protected from development, in large part thanks to your efforts, but that Pinelands preservation was not universally supported at the time. In fact, there was a fair amount of opposition. So could you talk about the kind of work that needed to be done to reach consensus and pass that legislation?
Well, rarely is there universal support for anything nowadays, even more so nowadays. So the approach is one that is outlined in the book. For example, in the first chapter is about the assault weapon ban. And that was a wonderful example of how the system is supposed to work, in my opinion. That, as you know, the assault weapon ban, and it remains today the case that it's very controversial, talk about gun regulation of any sorts. But I think that example of that issue, likewise with the Pinelands, where there is controversy as to how you prevail in those types of things. You've got to get people engaged, as I said, and get people informed. And it can be done. The assault weapon ban was a wonderful example of how, when I became the governor in 1989, that was the first example that I can remember of what we've been seeing more and more. School killings, guns in schools. Stockton, California, in early 1989, had a crazy fellow in a schoolyard shooting people with an assault weapon by children. I became the governor at the end of 1989, and I said to myself, this is something we want to try to avoid. We should get some laws passed to try to control some of the uses of guns, particularly these types of guns, which are military assault weapons. These are not weapons you use for hunting, for target shooting. And we undertook an effort to get through the legislature a law that would ban military assault weapons. And we did it. We worked very hard, were able to get support from it, and got the bill passed. The NRA, the gun lobby, organized themselves for the next election, and very successfully and very powerfully elected a legislature that was committed to repealing the law that we got passed. They were successful in passing the law. I was successful, though, in vetoing the law. They had the numbers to override my veto, and that was the big test. So what we did was organize a campaign. I mean, literally organize a campaign, because we had something like 90 days in order to have the veto upheld. And we organized a campaign that was a source of great pride for me. Because what we did is we got medical people, got them organized, go out and do op-ed pieces and interviews and things of that sort, to show the problems associated, the medical problems associated with gun violence. We organized the law enforcement people. These are the people on the front line. They came in. One fellow, a prosecutor from Camden County, pointed out how law enforcement people couldn't go into certain sections of the town because the bad guys had more firepower than the good guys did. We organized teachers who talked about the impact of gun violence on students in areas, particularly in the cities, that were really problematic. We organized with the ministers saying this was a moral issue. To make a long story short, we organized so well, got so many people engaged and informed about this issue that we prevailed and had the people on the other side of the issue have to admit defeat to such a degree that not a single senator voted to override my veto when the chips came down. A lot of them just didn't vote, but they didn't vote against us because the public opinion had been so formed, so well developed, that it was political suicide for anyone to vote with the NRA. And that's an example of how things can be done. There are lots of examples of how people can do things if you get, but not. For example, a woman's right to choose. A woman's right to choose is supported by overwhelming numbers of people. And yet we see actions being taken take away that right. Because a small, relatively small group of people, well organized, well financed, well, very much committed, can prevail over the majority. Same thing with gun violence. The vast majority of people say, who is not in favor of remedial measures to deal with gun violence? The fact of the matter is, the vast majority of people support taking such remedial measures. But a small, organized, disciplined, well-financed group of people prevail many times. It's starting to change. I'm really convinced that, for example, the fact that Governor Murphy ran for office with an affirmative position saying he was going to deal with gun violence would have been unheard of in the past. Nobody would ever raise that issue to put it forward because the thought was the NRA and the gun lobby would kill you. And that was the case. But if you're willing to go out and engage people and talk about the issues, you can prevail. I'll give you a wonderful example. You may recall, I guess it's about a year or so ago, the administration in Washington came out with an announcement saying that they were going to have a change in the immigration policies. That is a means of inducing people not to come here. They're going to have a policy of separating parents from their children and putting the children in custodial pens. About 3 or 4 days went by after that. And the public became so outraged about the idea of separating parents from children that it raised a real ruckus. And about 2 or 3 days later, people became so incensed, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, said, this is not acceptable. This is not a way to reduce people coming here saying you're going to separate them from their children. It's an example of where you can build a consensus if you're willing to go engage in the process. So that's a good example of how we can get things done, but it takes involvement. And we need a cadre of leaders. We need people who are out there on the point, who are committed to a cause, and who are willing to go spend effort and energy. So there's always a need for leadership. People in this audience may be the next generation of people to get things done. And the best way to get things done is to know what you're doing.
Governor, I'm going to stay with this issue just for a second more because I think it's important when, especially with the guns issue, when you see massacre after massacre. You couldn't blame young people for being really discouraged and thinking that nothing can change, the NRA is unbeatable. And the example of the assault weapons ban in New Jersey is a great example of how that doesn't have to be. And there are 2 points I want to make that may not be clear, because I was a reporter covering that issue at the time. One was that the opponents had a veto-proof majority in the Senate. In other words, they could, if they stuck together, they could eliminate the assault weapons ban on their own and nobody could stop them. And they went into this fight thinking that's what they were going to do. And the campaign that the administration did was so effective that they were too afraid politically to do it. But they had the votes, and were determined originally to do that. The other was that this ban was passed in an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. When the legislature voted on these bills, hundreds of NRA members came to Trenton and let it be known that many of them had guns. They surrounded the assembly, and I remember as the legislators were debating, they were all banging on the windows, creating this deafening, intimidating roar in the assembly chamber to try to intimidate them from not. So I think you made it almost sound like it was
less than peaceful. Let me say something about the other issue you raised, the Pinelands. It was another good example of where we had to work very hard to build the consensus for support. The motivation from, I was the sponsor of the bill in Washington that authorized the creation of these Pinelands. My motivation in large measure was interesting because there's this renewed interest. It's in the mid-'70s. There was serious proposals for oil drilling off the coast of New Jersey. And really, people who were remember back then, contracts were being let, the administration in Washington was pushing it, and it was looking like it was going to happen. It got to the point where oil drilling off of New Jersey would inevitably result in something that people were already starting to plan, which was a pipeline from the oil wells in the ocean straight through to the refineries on the Delaware River. That pipeline would run right through the Pinelands. The Pinelands, as you probably know, sits on top of the largest freshwater aquifer on the East Coast. It's a source of drinking water for people in South Jersey. An oil spill in that aquifer would have just destroyed the water supply for the whole southern half of the state. So what we did was to put the legislation in place, creating a Pinelands Reserve, which is, actually it's about 1/5 of New Jersey, in South Jersey, authorizing the state of New Jersey to take that federal legislation and use it to create a commission that would review and regulate the uses of the land on top of the aquifer. Got it through, got it passed. It was not an easy thing to get through. As you can appreciate, the oil industry didn't like that. They were planning on building the pipeline through there. The real estate people were not crazy about it. Bankers were not crazy about it. They were very concerned about restricting growth in this area. We were interested in preserving the right to restrict growth appropriately in the Pinelands area. And by the way, with hindsight, if we had not done that, with the development that took place in the 80s, the Pinelands that we now value would have been paved over. I mean, I'm convinced it would not look anything like what it looks like now. But we had to go out and work to talk to people about why it is that we should preserve this open lands. And that was something that the more we talked to people, the more we showed people, the more we had tours of the Pinelands, it became easier and easier and easier because we got people engaged and informed. When people do that, they start to build up resistance to bad things and support for good things. So it's another example of how you get public policy. Public policy, if you're making public policy in whatever field you're talking about, it's sometimes the lowest common denominator prevails. To cope with that, you've got to bring information to the task.
I'm going to follow up just on that. I'm going to open it up to student questions in a moment, but I just want to follow up on that. You've addressed many environmental issues in your career, and in the book you talk specifically a lot about climate change. Was there any point at which the threat of climate change became more urgent to you and kind of became front and center?
Well, one of the experiences I had as a life experience, what I mentioned before, we're all shaped by our life experiences. I was in the service, let's say, for 4 years, active duty, and I spent 2 years in Kodiak, Alaska. I was a meteorologist. They call it in the Navy an aerographer's mate. And I did flying ice patrols there. I saw how beautiful Alaska was. I saw what it was like when I was there in the 1950s. And then I started reading about what was happening in Alaska as a result of climate change and the whole change of the ecology. And that was something that was very significant to me, because it was just so startling what was there, and was startling to see what was happening. Melting was taking place, astroturf, rather, the turf, artificial turf was melting, and the world was changing. So those types of experiences helped me appreciate the significance of what's going on. And of course, since that time, I've been involved with water issues in my law practice, with a whole lot of other wilderness preservation issues as well.
Well, as a former reporter, I could ask questions for hours, but that's not why you're here, I'm sure. If we want to open this up to questions from students, and if we have time later, I can come back. But what questions do you have for the governor?
Yes, sir.
So I'll bring around a microphone just to.
Besides clean energy, what do you think is like the greatest danger to New Jersey, or like what should we be looking toward, or like what is your biggest focus right now?
I'm sorry, can you give me once again?
Besides clean energy, like what is your main focus for New Jersey, and like what do you think is the gravest danger to our state in the future?
Yeah, well, I think that probably the greatest danger to our state is just the fiscal situation that we have in the state of New Jersey. One of the things that I guess I get some credit for was I was the last governor to fully fund the pension system in New Jersey. As a result of the pension system not being funded, the pension deficit has grown to the point that it's probably now about $125 billion. That's a number that is almost impossible to understand how we're going to cope with it. The lesson that it teaches us is that you can't not fund things that are required to be funded. What has happened is that in 1993-94, we had a huge tax cut, which is, everyone likes tax cuts. This tax cut was particularly skewed toward the people at the top end of the income. They got proportionally more. It was regressive. As a result of the tax cut, revenues are diminished. Traditionally, when you do that diminution, you make cuts in the budget. This was a huge tax cut, which would require a huge deficit reduction program and a huge amount of cuts. Nobody at the time wanted to make those cuts. Accordingly, we lost the revenue, didn't make the cuts, and since we have to, by law, balance the budget, the only thing to do in somebody's mind was to stop making payments into the pension system. So we did that. The pension system has a void in it, and nobody else did it to this point. So from 1963 to now, nobody has fully funded the pension system. Hence, the deficit grows and grows and grows. That's the problem. You're not, interestingly enough, New Jersey is not unique in this area. New Jersey is not even the worst state. I think Illinois, one or two other ones, are as bad as we are. So this tells me down the road, everyone's going to have a problem dealing with this, and someone's got to think about how we cope with it. For another day, I'll give you my whole thing about how we have to change some fundamentals in this nation. Fundamentals like the concept of federalism. This is not even the worst problem. There are other problems that exist. We have healthcare problems, but we're going to have to change the way we think of our government system. As I said before, our system was put together in 1787. Things have changed in a whole lot of different areas. One of the things that is a major area of my interest, but is really a major area of the nation's interests is how we raise money. We have 50 different states, which was fine and is still fine. But the whole idea that every state should not be funding its own needs is fine as long as you have state needs. But nowadays, our needs governmentally are not really state-by-state needs. If you think about it, assault weapon bans or gun violence is not a state problem, it's a national problem. Cost of higher education is not a state problem, it's a national problem. Pharmaceutical costs, healthcare costs are not state problems, they're national problems. But the whole idea of dealing with them state by state results in all kinds of idiosyncrasies. You have problems not being addressed because the financing raised at the state level is not up to the task of dealing with these national problems. For example, if you are from Wyoming or you're from West Virginia, you are totally dependent upon the cost of revenues from the coal industry. Coal industry is not doing well, won't be doing well. Those states dependent upon those systems really are not going to prevail very well. If you are from Oklahoma or you're from Alaska, you are dependent upon the oil-producing industry. The oil industry is volatile. Revenues from those sources come, go, disappear, or are in great surplus. If you're dependent upon property taxes and you're from New Jersey, you know what it is being overly dependent upon property taxes. Mississippi is a sales tax-oriented state. It's the poorest state in the Union, and here dependent upon a regressive sales tax. The obvious answer is we're taking these national problems being financed by national systems. A national carbon tax would generate a substantial amount of revenue, will contribute to climate change improvements, and would make a lot of sense. Europeans use something called a value-added tax, a national tax. So these are things that ought to be thought about because they're problems down the road that are inevitable they're going to focus on. We are inclined to kick things into the next arena, not really deal with things, sort of muddle through. Thinking about big issues doesn't come easy. And this is where we need leadership. This is where we need people like you who are going to be out there willing to talk about things that are not easy to resolve, maybe painful, but leaders make the difference between short-term and long-term. Nobody likes taxes. Nobody likes potholes. How do we square that? Well, you raise the money to fix the potholes, or to have mass transit, or a healthcare system. That's really what has to be done. We need leadership. We need leadership of people who are willing to say, this is not a perfect answer, but it's an answer. And let us come reason together to figure out how it is we cope realistically, as opposed to just promising people whatever they want to hear. Pandering is a political time-honored tradition, but something we really can't tolerate too much longer.
So like based off of the last thing you discussed, I was always taught that states were like the laboratory for experiment with these programs. And don't you think if we create these national programs to solve some of these issues, that what if one of them messes up and it'll do something to the whole country instead of a single state?
I'm not sure I follow.
Well,
I'll try to restate it. Stan was saying that he's always heard that states were laboratories
Oh, yeah.
for experiments.
Yeah.
What if a national program is put into place and it has, I guess, unintended consequences, causes more problems than it fixes? When you're doing it state by state, the damage is limited.
I understand.
Is that fair?
Yeah, and that's a legitimate approach, legitimate question. My concept is what we're talking about is raising funds at the federal level. The Congress obviously is going to be there. State legislatures are going to be there. They're going to have political influence. And then we have to define what the systems are for getting the monies back. So, for example, New Jersey gets more than its fair share in some respects for housing programs. We don't need a whole lot of money for agriculture. So there's got to be trade-offs in terms of how you distribute the money. It's not the function that's changing. It's the means of financing the function that's changing. And then systems and formulas for distributing money can be done by the Congress, done by the state legislators for the monies. But the whole idea of continuing to have more and more functions and less revenue is a surefire prescription for anarchy. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But nobody wants to talk about that. And interestingly enough, another fiscal initiative that I feel strongly about, and I'm emphasizing in New Jersey, is something called public-private partnerships. So that transportation in New Jersey Transit is woefully underfunded. Our transit system is collapsing before our eyes. But the concept of relying exclusively on public sector monies for New Jersey Transit, as an example, makes no sense. And we have a really wonderful experience and a wonderful experiment that has been successful right here at Stockton College, as an example. All these beautiful buildings, all these wood facilities are happening at Stockton, at Rowan, College of New Jersey, because we have used something called the public-private partnership, which is a collaboration between public monies out of the state, out of the locality, and private sector monies. And how do you do that? Well, the way you do it is the way you've done it here, which is to have a collaboration. Private sector money goes into the collaboration. In return, the public sector offers the private sector the ability to use some of the resources, some of the land here, some of the facilities, parking facilities, perhaps in other places. And the private sector makes its return on money off of that utilization of the resources of the college or the university. The college or university gets dormitories, gets laboratories, gets other facilities off the private sector money. That whole idea was difficult to do because there was hard bargaining. Bargaining had to be, the private sector is not going to give its money up for nothing. Public sector is not going to give away control for nothing. And that has to be done. And this has been a wonderful example of how that could work. We're now trying to expand that to other areas. New Jersey Transit is a good example of where potentially all the transit facilities can be used to induce the private sector to come forward with money to rehabilitate and reconstruct the facilities, expand facilities, and in return, the private sector will make a return on its money. So it's that type of new thinking that I'm talking about when I talk about changing the federal system a bit. I think it can be done.
How do you recommend we solve New Jersey's pension crisis?
Well, I'm not really sure. I mean, what we're going to be having to do is talking about a federal system, probably. The federal system will contribute monies to pay off the thing. Because the amounts of money that you're talking about, the budget, if I recall correctly, was like $30 billion. How do you go get $125 billion? It's possible. I mean, you're yanking people around, holding out the prospect of doing something that is impossible to do. You're going to have to kick the issue up to a higher level so you could get advantage of the federal revenue source that's out there. Carbon tax will raise batches of money. But then what you'll do is, it's the same thing with healthcare. Healthcare, we're talking to people about containing healthcare costs, pharmaceutical costs. At the same time we're doing that, we're consolidating hospitals, we're consolidating insurance companies. Hospitals are now taking over insurance companies. Insurance companies are taking over hospitals. Essentially, we have a market system. A market system with less competition doesn't work very well. So we have to think through a little deeply what we're advocating, what we're talking about, make sure that it makes sense. Much of what we're talking about makes no sense because nobody wants to go in depth on any of these tough issues. Because if you go in depth, somebody's going to say, well, that's an interesting problem. What are you going to do about it? Nobody wants to say what they want to do about it because there are no easy options. There are options that are tough. There are options that are less tough. But there are options. And democracy is about making choices. And choices don't always have an easy choice and a bad choice. Sometimes you have a less bad choice and a bad choice. So engagement is the issue. The system doesn't work unless people are willing to at least acknowledge the reality of what the problem is. If you don't acknowledge the reality of the problem, what the pension problem is, as an example, you're never going to cope with it. You just keep yesing people to death. Well, this is the reputation of some political people. They just tell you whatever you want to hear, and that's not sustainable for any long period of time.
Hi, Governor. Hi. I had a question. As you were the last governor that came from our part of the state, from South Jersey, I was wondering, what is sort of the most, during your governorship, how important was it putting the issues that mattered in South Jersey when your experience here as governor?
Well, there is a difference. I mean, there's a big difference between the culture and so the lifestyle of people. For example, New York is North Jersey, Philadelphia is sort of South Jersey. Let me tell you a humorous story. The highlight, the first time I really fully appreciated North Jersey from South Jersey was one of the perks that the governor gets is a box up at the stadium, the Meadowlands Stadium. Okay. Wow. And the governors always invite 15 to 20 people, guests there for a game. Eagles and the Giants are playing. And the box is full of people from North Jersey. Randall Cunningham was the quarterback at the time. I remember him doing a quarterback sneak, touchdown, I cheer, silence in the box. Really a good example of the difference in the culture. It started to change, not necessarily for the good. I mean, traffic on Route 73 now is not what it used to be. There's traffic congestion. But that's more and more the reason for mass transit coming here. A line for Glassboro, from Camden to Glassboro, would be a very, very useful way of avoiding problems. Hopefully, we'll avoid some of the gridlock that happens up in North Jersey right now. But there's a different culture. I think I did something to sort of harmonize the two sides. But there is a difference. And in some respects, and John and I talked about this, the press is changing dramatically. I will say something that probably is not diplomatic. Local newspaper in Camden is an embarrassment. Reading this newspaper, if everybody in the state got their information from this particular newspaper, the well-being of the nation and the well-being of the state would be impacted dramatically. It's sad. But that, we don't get the coverage, you don't get the in-depth analysis. It's a serious problem. I mean, the right for get information, the First Amendment is extremely important. We're not doing it justice by having what we have now with the deterioration of press coverage. I mean, even in the debates, the debates are less inclined to inform people than entertain people. The debates are conscious efforts to get people to have at each other rather than clarifying things. So how we disseminate information, how we get people informed and involved is a very important thing that we have to start thinking about.
You've had a long career in politics, from local to Congress to being the governor, and I was wondering if you could go back to any point in your political career and do anything differently, what would it be?
Yeah. Well, not a whole lot. I wish I would have done not different, but more, just more of what I was doing. I spent a lot of time. I was known as the coffee clutch congressman. That's what I would do. And I got elected as the first Democrat in the 1st Congressional District in 102 years. And I turned it around to the point where the district was giving me 80% of the vote. And it was largely as a result of retail. Going out, someone would say, oh, Congressman Florio, I think you're nice, I'd like to be helpful, what can I do for you? I say, well, get 10 of your neighbors in your house next Thursday night. I'll bring donuts and coffee, and I'll have an opportunity to have a mini town meeting. And I'd have these town meetings on a regular basis. Every 2 weeks, I'd have some Saturday morning in the Belmar VFW or the Runnymede Fire Department. I'd have a meeting. We'd have anywhere from 20 people to 50 people, depending upon the questions that were being considered at the time. And it was a good give and take. And many people would say, well, I don't like what you do in Congress, I don't know how you vote, but you seem like a reasonable person. I'll be supportive of what you do. And it was a good way of facilitating information back and forth. And that's been a theme of my whole career. Information is what people need. You can't make decisions if you don't know what you're deciding about. And so I would have these town meetings. I'd have maybe 15 to 20 minutes of whatever the topic of the day was that I'd talk to people. And then I'd have people at me for an hour and a half, questions and answers or whatever. And that was a good way of disseminating information. So people have often asked me the difference between being a governor and a congressman is really the difference between being a legislator or an executive. A mayor or a governor or a president has one set of values and views. A congressman or an assemblyman or a mayor, local councilman is different. And which I liked, and actually each has attractiveness. You can be a congressman or a legislator, and I enjoyed that because that gives you an opportunity to go in depth into subject matter because you have a limited scope of responsibility. When you're an executive, the president or governor, you're an executive in charge of things, and you're charged with implementing and carrying out. So you can't go in deep as you can. You have staff for that, but you have to be in charge of everything. You're accountable for everything. You can't say, that's not my job. When you're the president or the mayor or the governor, everything is your job. So you can't go in deep, as deep as you can, but you have got a scope of authority that is very broad. So it depends on what your preference is.
What do you think Governor Murphy could be doing better for South Jersey right now?
He's spending time down. He was yesterday in New Brunswick. I was there with him, but he's spending time here. He's coming down this Saturday, I think, the 29th, whatever that is, here. And some of us are trying to educate him a little bit about the nuances of issues. Again, the whole idea of transportation being something we should be focusing on to avoid the traffic congestion in North Jersey, rather than waiting for it to come here, and then we'll have to deal with it at this point. For example, there is a huge mall that's been built up in the Meadowlands. It's gridlock now. The mall is coming here, there. Planning was not done well. This mall is overly financed. Now the economy is reasonably good. What happens when the economy slows down, which it will inevitably at some point? How is that mall going to survive? Traffic gridlock, overly financed, and not really being able to sustain itself. That's something somebody has to think about now rather than wait for things to come. And that's a problem we have, unfortunately, in so many areas. Putting off things that are not easy to deal with, not going to get easier, you have to start dealing with them. So a political person has to be prepared for some aggravation, has to be prepared, if they're going to do their job, to go out there and tell people things they may not want to hear, but they have to hear.
In your book, you discuss the role of the next generation in shaping.
I'm sorry.
In your book, you discuss the role of the next generation in shaping civic discourse. So how do you suggest that we encourage more young people in civic engagement, especially at the grade school level?
Yeah. Well, I think, much of it entails just being able to have conversations with people, because I'm convinced that it's a matter of common sense. We all have an inherent self-interest in life. And to the degree that I can go point out, if you go this way, this will happen. If you go this way, this has happened. Your choice. You have choices to make, but you ought to make choices in accordance with rationality. The criticism, my wife criticizes me as saying, I'm too rational. Everything is not rationality. There's other aspects of life, and I appreciate that. But we're inclined not to be able to think through one logical step to another one. You can be wrong by working from the wrong premise to an end, but the fact of the matter is, evaluate, and know what you're doing. Frankly, that's what this place is about. It's giving you as many options about life and choices as you could possibly have. But if you don't go through the drill of evaluating the options, coming to conclusions as to what's reasonable, what's not to expect of an outcome, then you'll just flip around and not really do things. But the whole idea of thinking logically is something that a lot of people don't. I see some of the comments at some of these rallies that the president has. It's bizarre. People saying things make no sense whatsoever to any semi-lucid person is troubling to me. And I've traveled the country well. I've been to areas of the country that are discouraging, where people have assumptions that are totally off the wall. But I think the vast majority of people presented with fair evaluations, presented with rational alternatives, will pick the right choice. It's something that I think we have to start focusing on much more readily. One of the pieces of advice that I give young people, I'll give two pieces of advice that I give young people to talk to me. It's first and foremost is to reject the advice that people have given, that saying that government is the problem. Government is not the problem. Government is a tool. It's a tool, as I said, that in the hands of good people is very valuable. The other advice I give to people is that try to maintain your independence as you become involved in life, particularly independence with regard to basic principles. In politics, it's a very important thing to do that. people that don't maintain their independence lose a lot. You have to maintain independence such that I adhere to the wisdom of that great philosopher, Janis Joplin. How many people know who Janis Joplin is? Okay. She said, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. I regard that as a statement that says that no one should ever become so invested in a program or a platform or a party or an individual, so invested that you can't walk away if you're not comfortable with what's being done. I was here at a ceremony that was honoring Bill Hughes, former Congressman Hughes, and I touched on the fact that he and I both were in the Congress together, and separately we were approached by a group of people associated with something called ABSCAM. That's your homework assignment. Go look up ABSCAM. What it did was it was involving some people who allegedly were Arab sheiks. The fact of the matter is they were undercover FBI people making offers to people that were not good. Bill and I compared notes after it was over, and we both concluded that we both felt very uncomfortable with these people and the things that they were starting to move to offer. And we just walked away. That's a good thumb rule. If you're uncomfortable with something, if you really think something is not appropriate and not correct, walk away. That's a good piece of advice that stood me in good stead. And to anybody who's involved in public policy, always just be prepared to walk away.
And ABSCAM was a sting, a corruption sting, and those who did not walk away found themselves indicted. I want to mention that event where the governor was there with Ambassador Bill Hughes. In November, the governor was awarded from the Hughes Center the Distinguished Lifetime Achievement Award, and that was one of the reasons he was there, so I just thought I'd point that out. We have time for a few more questions.
You said your strategy to produce public policy is to engage and inform. How do you reconcile the inform part when the country is gripped by fake news and seemingly lives in two opposing realities?
The last sentence, how to oppose?
How do you reconcile the inform part, informing citizens, when fake news is rampant and both sides of the political aisles seem to live in two different realities?
Well, there's a reality, there's really one reality. And so to the degree that you get people engaged, you engage competing realities, but that means that someone's got to come to a conclusion, make decisions. As I said, one of the limitations of our system is that we're reluctant to come to decisions, to come to conclusions. When you do make a decision-making process. That's why, in some respects, something that I understand you're doing here in the school is the whole idea of the election integrity program, making sure that people have access to the vote, have access and ease of voting. If somebody sits home and doesn't take part, that's not fulfilling our prophecy. Our prophecy is designed to get participation and then force the decision-making as to what is the appropriate approach. It just is a lot of retail work. It's just a lot of work, and it's a lot of work a lot of people don't want to do. Usually, the people who are advocating policies that don't make any sense and are needed to be changed aren't changed because the opponents who are organized stop things from happening. Usually, the people who even defend policies that are indefensible, tobacco people, gun people, coal people, they are pursuing policies that are almost objectively flawed, but they're making money out of it. Making money modifies people's judgment, and therefore they're doing things that make no sense. The vast majority of people who are in favor of limitations on coal, tobacco, guns, are the people who are in the majority because it is good public policy, but they're not organized many times, as well as people on the other side of the issue. But if the process works with integrity, the real public interest will out and will prevail ultimately. But it's a lot of work.
Governor, if I can follow up on that, we were talking about the news media earlier and an informed public. Do you think fake news is having an impact on how informed our public is?
The answer is yes, of course. I mean, people now have defined how to do it scientifically. I mean, the whole concept of foreign people coming and intruding into our elections. It's now almost an art form, be able to, just provoking. You see it happening all the time among the candidates, trying to provoke somebody into doing something that is disruptive, turning people against each other. There are political people who have perfected the new way of turning people against each other, artificially focusing attention on efforts to sort of get people to be fighting with other people. That's the new way of building a consensus. This will be the only partisan thing I'll say, I think, today, that I see the administration in Washington having a strategy for the next election of saying we're going to keep this small people, 40% of the people who believe it, as the president does, together. We're going to keep that group solidified. We're going to demonize the people on the other side. And then I suspect we'll have an October surprise next year. Whatever that surprise is, something will occur that will mobilize the president's supporters. It's going to happen. We have to be prepared. Those of us who don't agree with what's happening in Washington have to be prepared for doing that.
Do you think there's room for a genuinely bipartisan candidate to win an election?
A bipartisan candidate as a third party?
As either party, but like a person who is genuinely, crossing the border between the parties.
Well, I think the pendulum does swing back and forth over history. I think the pendulum has swung about as far right as it's far. So there'll be an inclination to come back somewhere towards the middle, which is where things usually settle out after a period of time. I think the question is, do people who may not agree with the president on the Republican side, who are moderate, do they come back or not come back quickly? I think there's getting to be an awareness that we've gone off the edge to the right too far, and maybe we should start coming back. The question is, how fast does that happen? And I think there's people are saying something's wrong. So I don't understand how joblessness is not bad. People are working nowadays, but they're still unhappy. There's something going on. And again, it's a disparity in terms of resources. Some people have done very, very well. And some people have done moderately well, but they've not caught up with the reality. In other words, I'm working, that's a good thing. I'm getting maybe a little bit of more money, but I'm not making enough to deal with my needs. I had a couple come to me, husband and wife came and said, we're both working and I'm taking a second job and we still can't make it. What the hell is going on? Who's doing this? And people say, and there's always somebody who said, I know who's doing it. It's that guy or it's that group. They're the ones that have done it. People look for reasons as to why their lives are like their lives. We all like stability. if there's institutionally deficiencies, things that are not being done that the consensus is should be done. It's like, shouldn't I have access to health care? Well, some people will say, well, health care is a commodity, like a shirt or a TV. If you can afford it, you can have it. If you can't afford it, you don't get it. On the other hand, others say, myself included, health care is not a commodity. Health care is an indication of citizenship. There's no person in the country who shouldn't have access to minimum half-decent health care. Philosophical argument, but a legitimate argument. People have to resolve those types of things. And if I'm worrying about my family's health care, as an example, or if my son or daughter is a talented person who could afford to go to a wonderful school, but we don't have the money to be able to, and we don't have the capability of borrowing. My granddaughter graduated from Fordham University. $68,000 to go to Fordham University. Pop had to contribute to that thing. But if someone hasn't got the ability to contribute, that resource as a natural resource that that person could develop into is lost. That's not right. So taking on these types of questions are something that we shouldn't think of as somebody else's problem. It's our problem too. So to the degree that the minimum thing you should do is become reasonably informed, get registered to vote, vote and participate however best you can participate. Doesn't mean everybody has to go out and run for Congress. I mean, join the PTA, do something to make sure that the system works the way it's supposed to.
We could have one more student question. I'd like to then wrap up with my final one. If anybody has one more?
We've exhausted you.
Thank you, Governor, for coming to Stockton to speak to us. And thank you for actually giving us an idea to add more reading to our senior seminar from earlier. So thank you for that. I had the students in senior seminar do some readings on federalism. You mentioned federalism in the last chapter of your book, so I thought that would be a good theme for them to read up on a bit. There were ideas of policy innovation, policy diffusion, comparative federalism. And my question is, where are you most hopeful for policy innovation? At the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, even at a transnational level, in terms of policy innovation going forward? Where lies your hope for innovative ideas that can help the public, whether, again, that's local, state, national, or even transnational?
The answer is all sectors. I mean, the world is changing so dramatically. I mean, really so dramatically. We're behind the curve, as I said before, in area after area after area. We didn't have an opportunity today to talk that much about foreign policy. Foreign policy is something that we've got to get our hands around because we're off in the wrong direction. We're off in the wrong direction in terms of the foreign policy imperatives currently dictate that we get into a more collaborative relationship with people around the world. We're spoiled after post-World War II. After World War II, we were dominant in a way that no other nation in history has been dominant for a period of time. We could afford to do whatever we wanted to do. We think of ourselves as benign, doing things for the world good, but it also happened to be for our good, which is fine. That's not the world today. Today, we should be striving to be first among equals. And we could do that, but we're not doing that at all. We have a foreign policy now that is catastrophic. We're alienating our allies. We're kowtowing to our enemies. We're doing all the wrong things. And someone's got to change that. Innovation is required to figure out new ways to assist ourselves, but new ways to assist ourselves, not at the expense of other people. So that's really one of the major things that's a source of concern for me. We've become so insulated. And it's not we, it's not the people, it's the government. The government is wrong in area after area after area. The whole idea, I mean, some minimum degree of loyalty to your ally. What we did to the Kurds was a sin. Pushing people out there, leaving them there, and then cutting them off. That's not a way to have foreign affairs conducted. So, again, at every level, at the local level, somebody's got to think about new ways of dealing with recycling, because the world is changing. The Chinese are not prepared to take our trash and garbage. That's a reality that's going to go on. So at every level of government, for example, Camden County government, a couple of years ago, did a really earth-shaking thing, consolidated public safety, put the city Camden police force in with the county police force. Good, works well. So that type of innovation is something we have to be thinking about. So you can't be locked into the status quo. You've got to have some changes, but the process has to be thoughtful so you make changes that make sense.
Great. I'm going to wrap up with one last question. And the William J. Hughes Center for Public Policy here at Stockton, one of our guiding principles has always been to encourage civic engagement, but also to encourage civil political discourse in the manner of Ambassador Bill Hughes and Governor Florio. Now, when you were governor, you had the Senate and Assembly were controlled by the other party, and you had some major political battles, and yet it never degenerated into name-calling or questioning the other's patriotism. You were able to keep it on a professional level even when you disagreed. And so when you look out at today's sometimes toxic political environment, how were you able to maintain such professionalism in your relationships, and what lessons might there be for today?
Well, it's interesting. What you described reflects our society as well. We've become much less civil, much uglier in terms of dealing with people. And again, this is something that starts with all of us. I mean, you've got to be able to interact with people. I mean, I saw the debates last night. I mean, I mentioned earlier to John that it made me reminisce about the early days that I was involved when debates were always conducted by the League of Women Voters. And they were civil debates. Nobody would ever think about calling somebody a liar or something of that sort. That describes the roughening of our society. So to some respects, it's a reflection of who we're becoming. That means we have to cope with it one-on-one by just holding ourselves to, I don't know how we're going to change the culture, but somebody should. And again, it comes back to what I talked about before. We need a leadership cadre for making improvements in all areas, including civility, including debates. Somebody ought to actually start talking about pressing the media, television, who conduct these debates. The questions are provoked. He said this about you, you're no good. What do you respond to that? That sort of thing. That's just tacky to start with. But over and above that, it's not conducive to an orderly civilization. We're in a sophisticated civilization. We want to have mutual respect, listen to people, and then work with the assumption that somebody starts out with good faith. Don't work from the assumption that someone is treacherous, mean, liar, or something. That sort of. But again, that may be beyond the scope of my capability of advising people. But all of us sort of think about, again, don't want to be overly partisan, but the fact of the matter, if you have a leader who's not capable of shame, that is going to say something about the society. We all have to be capable of some minimum degree of shame, because if you're not, there's no limits on how uncivil you can be.
I want to thank you so much for your time. I thought this was a really thoughtful, interesting discussion. I hope the students got a lot out of it, and so thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.